The blizzard arrived without ceremony, a thief on Christmas Eve, stealing the world and replacing it with a swirling vortex of white. Inside the midnight spoon, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and lonely desperation. Lena watched the snow plaster itself against the glass, each flake a tiny ghost pressing against the pane, trying to get in where it was warm. At 25, she felt older than the cracked vinyl on the booths, her dreams of painting vibrant canvases worn thin by the abrasive reality of serving lukewarm chili to truckers who never looked her in the eye. Her own canvas was this greasy spoon, her palette the shades of exhaustion that settled under her eyes. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a tiny hammer striking the anvil of her resolve. Just a few more hours. Mr. Gable, the diner's owner, a man whose soul had shriveled to the size of a prune, was counting the night's meager earnings, his grumbling a constant, grating soundtrack. The last two customers, huddled in a corner booth, spoke in hushed tones, their faces illuminated by the pathetic glow of the tabletop jukebox. Lena wiped down the counter for the 10th time, the repetitive motion a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the night. Then, the bell above the door chimed, a sharp, incongruous sound against the howl of the wind. A blast of Arctic air ripped through the diner, carrying with it a figure so utterly out of place it felt like a hallucination. An old man, impossibly frail, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He wore a traditional black silk kimono, the fabric a stark slash of midnight against the furious snow. Ice clung to his white hair and eyebrows, and he leaned heavily on a simple wooden cane, his posture exuding a dignity that the shabby diner could not diminish. He took a slow, deliberate step inside, the door swinging shut behind him, muffling the storm's roar to a distant complaint. The diner fell silent. The truckers stopped murmuring. Mr. Gable looked up from his cash box, his face contorting into a mask of pure annoyance. Lena simply stared, her breath caught in her throat. The man didn't look lost or confused. His dark, ancient eyes swept the room with a calm, assessing gaze, a king surveying a foreign and slightly disappointing territory. Those eyes, full of a quiet, unshakable power, finally settled on her. The midnight spoon was less a place of business and more a purgatory for the transient. Its flickering neon sign, with a perpetually buzzing S, promised refuge, but delivered only a temporary reprieve from the cold. The air inside was a layered history of past meals, bacon grease from the morning rush, burnt onions from lunch, and the ever-present bitterness of hours-old coffee. Pathetic strands of silver tinsel, drooping with moisture from the condensation on the windows, were Gable's sole concession to the holiday season. They looked less like decorations and more like the skeletal remains of a forgotten celebration. Lena knew every crack in the linoleum floor, every rip in the red vinyl seats. This place was the cage that held her captive, a constant reminder of the life she wasn't living. Her small apartment held a collection of canvases, blank and waiting, accusing her with their pristine emptiness. She dreamed in cobalt blue and cadmium yellow, but she lived in shades of beige and gray. The old man, now seated in a booth near the window, was a disruption to this monochrome existence. He was a splash of pure, deep color in her faded world. Mr. Gable stomped over to his booth, his cheap shoes squeaking on the damp floor. "Look, old-timer, this ain't a bus station. You want to sit, you got to order. And you got to have money to pay for it." His voice was a rusty saw blade, cutting through the quiet. The old man didn't flinch. He simply looked at Gable with an unnerving stillness, as if studying a particularly uninteresting insect. Lena felt a surge of protective anger, a feeling so foreign in this place of apathy that it startled her. She moved from behind the counter, her worn apron feeling like armor. The two truckers in the corner watched with mild interest, a brief diversion from their own bleak thoughts. This was the landscape of her life, small cruelties, weary souls, and a storm that threatened to swallow them all. Yet, the old man's presence changed the diner's emotional geography. He wasn't just another piece of driftwood washed in by the storm. He was like a mountain peak that had suddenly risen from the flat plains, ancient and immovable, forcing everyone to reconsider their own smallness. "He can have whatever he wants," Lena said, her voice quiet but firm. She stepped between her boss and the old man's table, a small act of defiance that felt monumental. "I'll cover it." Mr. Gable's face flushed a blotchy, unpleasant red. His small eyes narrowed. "You'll cover it? With what, Lena?" "The fortune you're making in tips tonight." He gestured around the nearly empty diner with a grimy hand. "You're an employee, not the hostess of a charity ball. This is a business." "He looks like he can't afford a glass of water." "Now get back to work and tell him to hit the road." The old man's gaze shifted from Gable to Lena, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He remained silent, allowing the small, ugly drama to play out around him, a silent judge at a trial of character. "It's Christmas Eve, Mr. Gable," Lena pleaded, keeping her voice low. "The storm is getting worse. Where is he supposed to go?" "Not my problem," Gable sneered. "My problem is paying the heating bill, which is going right out the door every time someone who isn't paying comes in. Now, for the last time, tell him to leave." But Lena didn't move. She thought of her own grandmother, who always said that kindness costs nothing but is worth everything. She looked at the old man's hands resting on the wooden cane, the knuckles gnarled but the fingers long and elegant. He was somebody's grandfather. He was a human being freezing in a storm. That was all that mattered. "No," she said. The word was small, but it landed in the diner with the weight of a boulder. Gable's jaw dropped. The truckers actually turned in their seats to stare. In 3 years of working here, Lena had never said no to him. She had swallowed his insults, endured his penny pinching, and cleaned up his messes. But tonight was different. The storm outside felt like it was mirroring a storm inside her. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was not frail as she had expected, but a low, resonant baritone, laced with a faint, elegant accent. "Young lady," he said, his eyes fixed on her, "your decency is a rare fire in a world growing cold. I would be honored to accept your offer." He then turned his gaze to Gable, and the temperature in the diner seemed to drop 5 degrees. "And you, sir, are a testament to the fact that a man can be impoverished in spirit, even with a pocket full of coin." The storm raged, sealing the midnight spoon off from the rest of the world. The roads were impassable, the power flickered ominously, and the last of the truckers decided to ride it out, hunkering down for the long haul. Mr. Gable, defeated by Lena's unprecedented rebellion and the sheer force of the blizzard, retreated to his office with a bottle of cheap whiskey, his muttering audible even through the closed door. An unspoken truce settled over the diner. Lena ignored the standard menu. The greasy burgers and watery soup felt like an insult to the quiet dignity of her guest. Instead, she went into the small kitchen and prepared what she would have made for herself on a night like this, a thick, hearty vegetable soup from scratch, using the last of the fresh carrots and potatoes. She toasted thick slices of rye bread, spreading them with real butter she'd hidden from Gable's miserly inventory. She served it to the old man not as a waitress serving customer, but as a person offering comfort to another. He ate slowly, with a refined grace that made the cheap ceramic bowl look like fine porcelain. When he was finished, he patted his lips with a paper napkin and gave her a small, formal bow of his head. "A meal prepared with care nourishes the soul as well as the body," he said. "Thank you." They sat in the quiet booth for hours as the storm howled its lonely song. He never offered his name, and she never asked. He didn't speak of his past or why he was walking through a blizzard in a kimono. Instead, he asked about her. He noticed the faint smudges of charcoal on her fingers that never quite washed away. "You are an artist," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. Lena, surprised, admitted her dreams of painting. She spoke of light and color, of capturing the emotion of a moment on canvas, dreams she hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in years. He listened with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time. He pointed to her hands. "These hands, they are not meant only for wiping counters. They are meant to create. Do not let the world convince you otherwise." His wisdom was simple, yet it landed in her heart with profound weight. He was a stranger, yet he understood the core of her being better than anyone she knew. In the heart of the Christmas Eve storm, in a forgotten diner, a quiet, powerful bond was forged between a weary waitress and a mysterious old man. Christmas morning arrived with a fragile, pristine beauty. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick, undisturbed layer of snow. The sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, made the landscape glitter as if it were dusted with diamonds. The diner was cold and silent. The truckers had departed at the first light, and Mr. Gable was still passed out in his office. The old man was gone. Lena found his booth empty, wiped clean. On the table sat a small, exquisitely carved wooden crane, its wings half spread, as if about to take flight. Tucked beneath it was a crisp $100 bill. It was more than enough to cover 10 meals, a silent, generous thank you. She picked up the crane. Its smooth, dark wood warm against her cold fingers, a tangible piece of the strange, magical night. She clutched it in her hand as she heard Gable stirring. He emerged from his office, his face puffy, his eyes bloodshot. He saw the empty diner, and his gaze immediately fell on the $100 bill in her hand. He snatched it from her before she could react. Well, looks like your charity case wasn't so broke after all, he sneered, stuffing the bill into his pocket. Good thing, too. It'll cover the cost of you leaving. Lena stared at him, stunned. What? You're fired, he said, his voice flat and cruel. I can't have an employee who undermines my authority, gives away my food, and turns my diner into a flophouse. You think you're some kind of saint? Go be a saint on someone else's dime. Pack your things and get out. Your final check will be mailed to you. There was no point in arguing. She saw the finality in his dead eyes. She didn't feel anger, or even sadness, just a profound emptiness. She had done the right thing, and this was her reward. She quietly went to the staff locker, which contained her threadbare coat, a worn copy of a book on art history, and her purse. With the small wooden crane safely in her pocket, she walked out of the Midnight Spoon for the last time, stepping into the blindingly bright, uncertain future of a jobless Christmas morning. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. Lena pulled her thin coat tighter, her boots crunching on the perfect, untrodden snow. The world felt muffled and new, a blank canvas waiting for a first stroke. She had taken only a few steps down the deserted street when the sound reached her, a low, powerful hum that was utterly alien to the morning's silence. A convoy of 3 immaculate black sedans, their tinted windows like obsidian, turned the corner and glided to a stop in front of the diner. They moved with a silent, predatory grace, their tires making no sound on the fresh snow. They weren't just cars, they were a statement of intent. Doors opened in unison, and several men in sharp, dark suits emerged. They moved with a disciplined purpose, fanning out to secure the area, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Mr. Gable, drawn by the noise, came scurrying out of the diner, a sycophantic smile already plastered on his face, assuming they were wealthy, important customers. He was completely ignored. The rear door of the lead car opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lean, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that likely cost more than Lena made in a year. His black hair was impeccably styled, and his face was a study in handsome, severe lines. But it was his eyes that held all the power, dark, intelligent, and radiating an intensity that was both captivating and terrifying. He scanned the scene, his gaze dismissing Gable with contemptuous ease before it landed, with unerring accuracy on Lena. He started walking towards her, his expensive leather shoes the only things marring the pristine snow. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had never been told no, a man who owned every space he occupied. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the faint gold flecks in his dark eyes. He didn't smile. His expression was one of serious, focused evaluation. Then he spoke, his voice a low, controlled baritone, much like the old man's, but edged with steel. "My grandfather sent me," he said, his gaze unwavering. He said he found a treasure hidden in a storm. He then turned his head slightly, his voice rising just enough to carry to the gawking Mr. Gable. The words he spoke next shattered the morning's quiet and Lena's entire reality. "This woman," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "is to be my wife. You will address her as such." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute, a vacuum where sound and reason ceased to exist. Lena's mind reeled, unable to process the words. Wife. It had to be a mistake, a cruel, incomprehensible joke. Mr. Gable was the first to break the spell, letting out a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. "Wife. Are you crazy?" he scoffed, his courage foolishly bolstered by disbelief. "This is Lena. She's a waitress. A nobody from nowhere. I just fired her 5 minutes ago." The handsome man, who Lena now knew must be related to the old man from the diner, didn't even grant Gable a glance. His entire universe seemed to have narrowed to Lena, but his lack of attention didn't mean he hadn't heard. With a barely perceptible nod of his head, one of the suited men stepped forward. He held a slim, high-tech tablet, and on its screen was a satellite image of the diner. With a flick of his thumb, he swiped through pages of documents: the deed to the property, a list of Mr. Gable's substantial debts to dangerous people, surveillance photos of him skimming from the register, and a final document showing a transfer of ownership, dated that morning. The Midnight Spoon, the land it sits on, and all associated debts now belong to Mr. Jean, the suited man said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your employment, and indeed your presence here, Mr. Gable, are terminated." Effective immediately, Gable's face drained of all color, turning a pasty, sickly gray. The sneer vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed terror of a man whose miserable little world had just been casually annihilated. You can't do that," he stammered. Jean finally turned his head, his cold eyes pinning Gable in place. "I can," he said, the two words carrying the weight of absolute power. "And I have." He then turned back to Lena, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He gently reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were still clutching the small wooden crane. He carefully pried her fingers open and looked at the carving. "My grandfather said you would have this," he said, his voice now a low murmur, meant only for her. "It is a symbol of a promise kept. A symbol of honor." Lena could only stare, trapped between the terrifying display of power that had just dismantled her former boss's life and the impossibly gentle touch of this man's hand. Her world was tilting on its axis, spinning wildly, out of control. Jean led her to the warmth of the waiting car, the door closing with a solid, satisfying thud that sealed them off from the world. Inside, the scent of rich leather and quiet power replaced the cold, thin air of the street. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. "My name is Jean. The man you sheltered last night was my grandfather, Mr. Sato." Lena found her voice, though it was a mere whisper. Is he okay?" The question, so full of genuine concern for the old man rather than for her own predicament, seemed to surprise Jean. A flicker of warmth entered his eyes. "He is resting. He is old, and his heart is not strong. The doctors told him not to travel, especially not in this weather. But he is a stubborn man." He said he had one final piece of business to attend to. He paused, choosing his words with care. "My family, we operate in a world of contracts, debts, and alliances. It is a world of power, but it is often devoid of honor. My grandfather grew to despise it. He believed it had poisoned our bloodline." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze earnest. "He was dying. His final wish was to find an anchor for me, someone outside of our world. Someone with true strength, the kind that cannot be bought or broken. He believes that character is revealed not in how we treat our superiors, but in how we treat those we perceive as beneath us. So he went out into the storm, dressed as a man with nothing, to see if anyone in this cold world still had a fire inside them." Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. "He found you, Lena," Jean continued, his voice dropping lower. "He saw you defy a petty tyrant for a stranger. He saw you offer warmth and food not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. In you, he saw the honor our family has lost." He finally addressed the most unbelievable part. "The marriage, it is his design. A shield. In my world, to be unattached is to be vulnerable. To be attached to me makes you untouchable. It is his way of protecting the treasure he found. And it is his way of giving me a reason to be a better man than my father was. It wasn't a proposal born of love, but of a profound, inherited respect. It was a promise, a duty, and in its own strange way, it was the most romantic declaration she had ever heard. As the car wound its way through the snow-covered city, it passed the midnight spoon again. Lena's breath caught in her throat. A large, unmarked truck was parked outside, and men were already boarding up the windows. A stark, simple sign had been hammered into the frozen ground. Closed. Under new management, Mr. Gable was nowhere to be seen, erased as easily as a chalk drawing in the rain. A complicated knot of emotions tightened in Lena's chest. There was no pity for Gable. He had been a small-minded, cruel man who earned every bit of his misfortune. But the speed, the finality, the sheer effortlessness of his removal was terrifying. It was a glimpse into the world Jean inhabited, a world where justice was not a slow, grinding process but a swift, decisive blade. She turned to Jean, her voice trembling slightly.
What happened to him?
To Mr. Gable? Jean didn't look away, nor did his expression change. He met her gaze with unflinching honesty. He was a man who exploited his employees, cheated on his taxes, and had dealings with unsavory people. He built his small life on the misery of others. He will no longer be in a position to harm anyone. His debts have been collected. The euphemism hung in the air between them, cold and heavy. This was the first true test. Could she reconcile the man who spoke of honor and protection with the man who could dismantle a life with a single nod? This was her chance to demand to be let out, to run from this dangerous, gilded cage he was offering. But then she looked at his face, and for the first time, she saw past the power and the perfect suit. She saw a deep, abiding weariness in his eyes, the burden of a man born into a life he hadn't chosen but was honor-bound to lead. He was not a monster. He was a product of his world, trying to fulfill the last wish of a grandfather he clearly adored. He was using the brutal tools he had been given to carve out a space for something good. "You did that for me?" she asked softly. "Because of what he did to me?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I did that because my grandfather taught me that cruelty, no matter how petty, should have consequences. He taught me that you would understand that, and in that moment, she did." She saw the old man's wisdom weaving through this impossible situation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about protecting the kind from the cruel. She made a choice. She would not fear this man. She would try to understand him. The car finally passed through a set of imposing iron gates and up a long, winding drive. The destination was not a cold, modern mansion, but a serene, traditional estate that seemed to have been transported directly from the hills of Kyoto. Snow lay heavy on the graceful, curved roofs of the main house and the surrounding pines, creating a scene of profound peace. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the scent of cedar and green tea. It was a place of quiet elegance, of shoji screens and polished darkwood floors. And there, sitting in a comfortable chair overlooking a tranquil rock garden, was Mr. Sato. He was dressed in a simple cotton yukata, a blanket over his knees. He looked frail, but his eyes were bright and clear. When he saw Lena, a genuine, radiant smile spread across his face. "I knew it was you," he said, his voice soft but filled with satisfaction. "The moment I saw the fire in your eyes when you stood up to that foolish man, I knew." Jean walked to stand beside Lena, and in the presence of his grandfather, his powerful aura seemed to soften, replaced by a quiet, deferential respect. He was no longer just a formidable boss, but a grandson seeking approval. He turned to Lena, and the question he asked was not a command or a statement of fact, but a genuine, humble plea, stripped of all his worldly power. "Lena, my grandfather has offered us a strange and sudden beginning," he said, his voice earnest. "But nothing about it is false. I know I have no right to ask this of you. Your life has been turned upside down. But I would be honored, truly honored, if you would allow me to try, and build a real life with you. A life of warmth, not of storms. A partnership. He was offering her a choice. Her old life was gone, a dead-end road that had abruptly crumbled behind her. Ahead was this terrifying, unbelievable new path. But it was a path that had opened up only because of her own simple act of kindness on a cold Christmas Eve. It was a future forged not by accident, but by her own character. She reached into her pocket, and her fingers closed around the smooth, comforting shape of the wooden crane. It was a promise kept. It was a symbol of honor. She looked from the wise, kind face of the old man to the intense, vulnerable one of the man beside her. She saw her future not as a trap, but as a vast, unpainted canvas. "Okay," she said. The single word was a quiet revolution, the first brushstroke of a new and extraordinary life. A life where the humble waitress who sheltered a stranger in a storm would become the unshakable heart of an unlikely king, and together, they would build a new kind of kingdom.